Now, in the last episode, you and I had a really cool discussion on how life always found a way, how resilient life and evolution in its whole process was. We know that Earth went through certain major extinction events, five to be exact, and quite a few minor extinction events, which are way more adverse than what you and I have lived through in our natural climatic changes and disasters. And yet, life kept on evolving all through that. And it evolved to a point where it became more and more resilient and more resourceful as time went by. And then that whole journey finally brought us to this convergence point where humans and chimpanzees sort of coexisted. Hominids, as we call them, the great apes, they coexisted. And from this point onwards, we'll have a branching out of the great apes and humans. Now, this is a very curious position in our historical timeline that you and I are approaching, because from this point onwards is where itihas or history actually begins, right? Because now we are about to talk about humans and their evolution and how things took place, and this is what essentially history is. But I would still ask you to hold on to your paleontology and anthropology hats a little longer, because this story of human evolution in itself is pretty cool. It's pretty amazing, because there is a fundamental question to which we still don't have an answer for. And yet, even though we've had so many specimens discovered, even though we've had so much technology being involved into this to retrace how humans would have evolved, we still don't have the answer to that really big question. And this is something that I'll post to you by the end of this podcast and see what you have to think about something like this. And yeah, so I welcome you all to our Itihas podcast. My name is Arnapati, and let's take our journey towards the evolution of humans. Now, the craziest thing to imagine here is the fact that when we look at the theory of evolution, we can talk about how whatever exists, whatever life form that exists on Earth today has evolved from a particular ancestor, and that ancestor can be traced back as far as we want to, and we will finally reach the very first living cell, right? That's how evolution occurred. So the same happens in the case of humans as well, where the evolution of humans can be traced back to particular ancestors or particular ancestries, and the farther back we go, the farther and more primitive we become and in comparison to us humans. And being in that same vein, you and I can trace back to the exact point from where humans or Homo sapiens started evolving into what we are today. Now, you and me, us, the modern humans, we belong to a family of primates known by the name of hominids, or the great apes. Now, these great apes by themselves include 4 genera, which would include orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and us humans. And the coolest part here is that if we again start tracing back, there comes a convergence point about 7 to 8 million years ago in Chad in Africa, where that particular ancestor can be found, which from where the branching of chimpanzees and humans occurs. And that particular fossil was named as Sahelanthropus when we found it. The French paleontologist Michael Brunet was the one who dug up the fossil in 2001, and since then, it has been that particularly important connecting piece in the puzzle of human evolution. Now, as a disclaimer, you don't really need to remember the names of every single species that I would mention, though it'll help in making our story. But what I do want you to do is keep in mind as we trace this whole evolution from the divergence point of the Sahelanthropus fossil and see how humans actually became who we are today, right? Now, when we talk about humans, there should be certain human characteristics that we are giving it so that it is very clear that it's a human and not a great ape. And there are quite a few characteristics that get listed down, but here I would want you to focus on a few things. Number one is obviously the large brains. Humans have the largest brains relative to the body size to any animals on Earth. And that plays a huge role in how we look at resources, how we develop tools, and how we have evolved as well. Similarly, our ability of bipedalism frees our hands to, again, makes us dexterous around tools and helps us again forage better resources and other things that we'll obviously account for as we move in our story forward. And then finally, the whole presence of morality and the idea of an abstract thought is something again which is quite unique to humans in the form that it is existing today. Now, obviously, there are also other different things that can differentiate humans from other great apes. The way they walk, the way the cranium is connected to the spinal cord, and all the other things are there. But right now, the reason why I mentioned these particular characteristics is because these would start differentiating us from the very early stages of development, from that 7-8 million years ago period. Now, as we look back, we know that about 7 to 8 million years ago, there was a species by the name of Sahelanthropus tchadensis, which existed as that diverging point of humans and chimpanzees. Now, a million years later, we find the fossil of Australopithecines, which was living in Kenya and walking upright, but still adapted to climbing on trees more than they were towards bipedalism. Then we had Australopithecus ramidus, which lived in Ethiopia around 4.4 million years ago. They walked upright. They had smaller, more human-like teeth. Basically, the canines weren't that long. And their brain size was still smaller than the modern chimpanzees, but they were still showing a good growth in their brain size. Now, mind you, this Australopithecus ramidus, the brain size they have, it is still 20% of the human brain size. Now, about 4.2 million years ago, the first Australopithecus species evolved. Now, Australopithecus anamensis was about the size of a modern chimpanzee, but the males were much larger than the females, and it had a large habitat range which expanded from Kenya to Ethiopia, which is what the bones are telling us, which is what the remains tell us. Now, by around 3 million years ago, this Australopithecus species was dominating almost all of Africa, large parts of Africa, and had branched out to distinct species as well. It branched out to Australopithecus afarensis and Australopithecus africanus. Now, Australopithecus afarensis had a brain which was about 1/3 the size of modern humans and lived in a large area stretching from Tanzania to Ethiopia. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the Australopithecus africanus had a slightly larger brain, smaller teeth, and a pelvis that was more adapted towards upright walking. So, even in this span of about from 8 million years to 3 million years, which is a span of about 5 million years, we are seeing that different species are being more adapted towards walking upright. They're developing a bigger brain size. Now, these two things, like I said, are getting closer and closer to how humans are. So, they're getting a bigger brain size, which is giving them more intellect, and their hands are becoming freer and freer. And you will see how this will impact as we go forward. See, by 2 million years ago, some Australopithecus species were adapting to a diet of nuts and seeds by evolving huge teeth and powerful jaw muscles, and these became a separate species which was known as the Paranthropus, which were also colloquially known as the nutcracker man because most of their diet was consistent of a diet on seeds and nuts. Whilst the other Australopithecus species were evolving in a very different direction, becoming taller, for example, the Australopithecus sediba, and then developing smaller teeth but a larger brain so that they were capable of making tools out of the stones or the bones that they were using to eat. Now, here is a great distinction between how evolution and diet is affecting how things are going to go forward. Because look at it this way. There is one group which has become quite adapted towards digging out nuts and seeds. So through evolution, through natural selection, that particular species has produced babies which are again inherently becoming more and more adapted towards eating seeds and getting nuts out. So here, how natural selection would work is that those kids, those small babies of this particular species who do not have stronger jaws would die out because they won't be able to live on this diet. And let's say the kids which would develop that stronger jaw would live on and will go on to have more progeny. And this is how that differentiation happens. And from that particular Australopithecus species, we have a completely new branch known as the Paranthropus, which became so dependent on on the diet of nut and seeds that they through evolution and through natural selection just developed a stronger jaw. Now, same thing happens with the other species of Australopithecus, where we see that they, instead of putting their evolutionary points into a stronger jaw, put their evolutionary points into their developing their own brain. And becoming capable of using tools. Now, these became the genus Homo, and this is where that differentiation begins, where we are recognizing that a completely different genus is required to represent the evolution in the brain size and their tool usage and their enhanced diet, which is quite different from what the Paranthropus man was eating. So, during this time period, you can completely understand that Paranthropus and the Homo habilis, the handyman, they were coexisting together. And this coexistence lasted for more than 1 million years. And just to put that into perspective, you and me, the Homo sapiens, we've been on this earth for about 300,000 years. So can you imagine this sort of coexistence between two different species of hominids was happening for 1 million years? Now, 1 million years is a long time, especially when it comes to natural selection and evolution, because just as we saw with Paranthropus, where through millions of years they were able to develop a jaw that is strong enough to crack down nuts and seeds, same sort of process is going to happen to the Homo habilis. Now, during this coexistence, imagine a situation where there's a small part of land where both Paranthropus and Homo habilis are coexisting. Now, in this small patch, the amount of resources are quite limited. But here, Paranthropus would be able to easily eat certain hard nuts and seeds much better than what the Homo habilis would. But our handyman here, with the use of certain tools, would be able to hunt down game better, would be able to dig up roots better, and would in general be able to extract more resources through the use of tools than compared to the Paranthropus. Now, I put in the same formula of the natural selection and evolution here, where I would see that as time goes by, the particular, let's say, group of Homo habilis which were creating better tools with more resources will have more resources for them to reproduce and, let's say, nurture their young. So their line would continue compared to a Homo habilis who's not very good at creating resources or tools out of whatever is given to them. Now, during that same period of time, the Paranthropus population were very much limited to their diet of nuts and seeds and other things, will get into a complete competition with the Homo habilis. But just because the Homo habilis, this newly developed Homo habilis, can get more resources out of the same piece of land, evolution will make sure that the Paranthropus species slowly dies out. And that's exactly what happens. Eventually, the big-brained Homo species just outcompetes the larger-jawed Paranthropus species, which went extinct by about 1 million years ago. The most successful species of the genus Homo in this period was Homo erectus. Now, this species by 1.4 million years ago had developed a brain size of about 1000 cc, which is 70% of the size of the modern man. Now, not only did the Homo erectus come to dominate Africa after all the other hominid species had gone extinct, but it also was the very first Homo species to migrate out of Africa to settle in Asia and Europe. Before we even start talking about Homo erectus and how they evolved out of Africa and how they become Homo sapiens, I think this is a good opportunity for us to look back during the very first few minutes of this conversation, where we spoke about a fundamental question that gets asked every time we speak about human evolution. And I think this is a good space for us to put that question right here. So I'm going to lay it out in front of you. See, at some point, something must have happened where an insight might have occurred which led towards this particular hominid species viewing a bone or a big stick more like a tool and less like a plaything. And what I want you to ponder on is the fact that most of the times when you learn something, you learn it from someone else, right? You are learning it. So someone out there did learn it first. And that branch can be traced back to the origin of that particular idea. But the insight towards making tool is so primitive, so banal, and yet so fundamental towards the whole generation of the hominid species that it just marks a completely new territory. And what I want us to discuss here or think about is what would have actually happened during that very first thought. Now, it's quite abstract to think about. In fact, I know there's this movie called 2001: The Space Odyssey, where they say that aliens came in and planted this particular device which gave the apes insight, and from there evolution happens. But you and I haven't really found any sort of evidence for that yet. So it's safe to assume that the insight occurred as a particular neuron got connected to another neuron, and that's it. That's what marked the beginning of human evolution. Now, circling back to our conversation about Homo erectus, we know that Homo erectus was the very first hominid species that started migrating out of Africa. Now, the reason why we are able to trace these migrations is because we start finding the remains, the skeletal remains, the fossils from different parts of the world around during this time period, and they almost follow a similar timeline. For example, around Georgia, we find the Homo erectus georgicus, a subspecies of Homo erectus itself, which was found around 1.8 million years ago. Similarly, we find this particular fossil in Obedia in Israel, which was dated to 1.7 million years ago. And fascinatingly enough, about 300 to 400,000 years from then, which is about 1.4 million years ago, we find a fossil evidence which we named the Mojekerto child in Java. And the reason why this is fascinating is because back then, Java was connected to the mainland. There was no water there. Water levels had not risen to the point where Java became an island. So we keep finding these. Now, as we trace back, we see that about 800,000 years ago, Homo erectus had reached Western Europe, Northwest Africa, and China, and had already begun to evolve and adapt to the different environment it found. And the mention of environment here is important because we know that environment is going to act as one of those key funnels that will channel evolution through natural selections in different directions. Because look at it this way, we know that as we go farther north, the climate becomes much more colder. And with colder climate, you have a scarcity of resources. There might be lesser vegetation, which might affect how hunting happens. Similarly, if you go closer to the equator, there is more rain, there is more forest, the kind of food that is available, the kind of temperature that is available, it'll completely change how these things will affect the evolution process going forward. So naturally, we'll find that the Homo erectus from this point onwards will start developing larger and larger brains, which will help them make more complex tools. Now, during this time period, you'll find a lot of paleontological papers and researchers and articles referring to these larger-brained Homo erectus species as Homo heidelbergensis, which later on gets grouped into the name Homo rhodesiensis. And here is the crazy part about history. As we start getting closer and closer towards the modern times, the type of fossils that we get become much more diverse, they become much well preserved, and it just gets easier for us to study them. And that is exactly what starts happening by the mid and late 20th century, where you have this renewed vigor towards unearthing every single piece of this human evolution. Now, as a result of this, what starts happening is we start getting a lot more subspecies of these Homo erectus or Homo habilis or Homo heidelbergensis species. Now, here I don't really need to discuss each and every single species, but what we do need to consider here is how that evolution actually took place. Now, let's keep Homo erectus as our pivot point. So, just pivoting a little back from the Homo erectus, I want you to think what kind of lifestyle there would have been during this time period. So if we look at somewhere between 3 to 2 million years ago and trace that journey till Homo erectus, which is about 800,000 years ago, we find that there are a lot of different changes that have started happening with this Homo species. The first one is the idea to act in a cooperative way. We see signs of big groups of these Homo species going for hunts or forage or live together just to save themselves from predators or actually make the possibility of getting resources much more successful. Now, during this time period, the kind of evidences we start finding in terms of bones and the injuries on them tells us that the Homo species was not really adapted towards really saving themselves from the predators that existed during this time period. There have been bones that we found of small Homo species children where there are gouge marks or claw marks on the cranium. There is this 2-year-old cranium that was found, which was likely being hunted down by a predatory bird. Then there were the saber-toothed cats that you must have seen, which were pretty real. And then at the same time, we have found certain femurs which have crocodile bite marks, which tells you that they were going through a lot of hardship. But at some point, they must have been able to go through them in a much more structured manner, where they learned that certain areas are more dangerous and how to basically save themselves from those dangers. And this is probably what led them to start living together, maybe not in very large group, but groups which would at least keep themselves secure. Now, at the same time, I was telling you about how planning was a big part of this evolution, where they would plan on where to go next, where to hunt and where to forage. So the idea that they can plan for future, think about future, was again a big evolutionary jump for us, because that again increased the efficiency of getting resources, and resources as at this point is everything. See, at the end of the day, when we talk about migration of these human species, why would they migrate? Why would they go from one place to another? The only answer here is probably either to get to a much more secure place of resources, or just to get better resources. That has and always will be one of the biggest motivators for any living species. Now, one of the biggest yardsticks to measure the kind of development that was happening in these Homo species is to look towards their tools. And here I have to classify what tools were, because we know that almost all primate species have the ability to use tools. In fact, there are other animals and mammals who have the ability to make tools, but humans during this time period were able to modify these tools. It wasn't just about picking up a stick and then using it, but it was about sharpening it. It was about taking rocks and creating edges out of it. And that's what we see when we start looking at the Lomekwi tools, which are about 3 million years old. And these Lomekwi tools are by far the oldest modified tools that we have found. And these modifications tell us that at some point, the efficiency of resources, especially the kind of food that we were going to eat, was going to jump and skyrocket. And this skyrocketing really helped us develop our brains even more, because look at it this way, a bigger brain required more calories, more energy to function. So if there wasn't the availability of more calories, then there couldn't have been the evolution that would have given us a bigger brain. And this is where the puzzle pieces start falling in place, because we know that most of the times when these Homo species were foraging, they were consuming plant-based food, so nuts, seeds, and roots, but they by themselves are not enough to give that calorie boost, the boost in consumption that we need to support a bigger brain. So at some point, there must have been a good shift towards eating meat, and a realization must have come where meat was nutritional enough to provide us more and more motivation towards hunting more meat. And finally, the last piece of evidence that I want you to look at is the size of each Homo species that comes through, because we know right from the diverging species of Sahelanthropus and continuing towards the Australopithecus and Paranthropus, we see that the size of these predecessors as well as the Homo species starts increasing. Now, this particular increase could correspond to the type of evolution that we are going through. For example, a longer femur and a larger gait would probably help us walk longer distances, but at the same time, as we go forward in time and we start reaching that Homo erectus species time period, we'll see that there is going to be convergence and divergence both based on the environmental factors. And that's exactly where we'll pick up our Homo erectus journey. Now, as we go towards 500,000 to 250,000 years ago, we see that the descendants of these Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, they really start to diverge into truly separate species in different regions of the world. We have hominids in Europe, which start to evolve into what will become the Neanderthals. Then we have in Africa, which will see the evolution of Homo heidelbergensis towards the modern man, which is the Homo sapiens. And one of the examples of this is the Bodo cranium that we found in Ethiopia, which is dated to about 600,000 years ago, which already had a brain size of 1250 cc, which is about 88% of the size of the modern man. And similarly, in East Asia, we have Homo erectus, which was also developing a larger brain, but at a slower rate. The finds referred to as the pecking man and thus uncovered at the Yujian have an average brain size of about 1075 cc. Now, about 130,000 years ago, we see three clearly different hominid species that have evolved. We have the Neanderthals, a hominid species which are very similar to the modern man, but are much more stronger and stockier and more adapted to the cold environments, which lived in Europe and Middle East. Then in East Asia, we have a smaller brained Homo erectus hominids, which were still thriving, and in Africa we have the Homo sapiens, who have evolved. Now, all three of these species had originally developed from Homo erectus, and all three evolved larger brains as a survival strategy. But only one of them would have what it took to dominate the world and outcompete the other two. The very first few evidences of our own species leaving Africa comes from the advanced stone tools that are found in Jebel Faya in UAE, which are dated to about 125 to 90,000 years ago. Now, these tools are the same ones that were being used by the Homo sapiens species in Africa during this particular time period. And then we start finding stronger and stronger evidences which come in terms of actual skeletal remains of Homo sapiens, which are found in Kafis and Skul in Israel, where these are being dated to about 115 to 90,000 years ago. Now, as the Homo sapiens moved out of Africa, they were bound to come in contact with the other species. For example, the contact between Neanderthals or Homo neanderthalis, which happens in somewhere in the Middle East, because we know the Neanderthals were also there present in the Middle East. Now, one of the greatest evidences of conflicts are what we find in the skeletal remains of Neanderthal, which was wounded by a projectile weapon. And this kind of weapon was being used by the Homo sapiens during this time period. This particular evidence or the particular cranium we find in Shanidar caves in Iraq. And then there has also been quite a few evidences of interbreeding between these two species, where we find that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were interacting in that capacity, because the evidence of interbreeding comes from our own DNA, where we find that almost all modern humans outside of Africa have small amounts of Neanderthal DNA in them, which ranges somewhere between 1 to 4%. And this also tells us another amazing thing, that the reason why this kind of interbreeding exists today in genes of people outside Africa shows that there wasn't really a large-scale migration by the Neanderthals towards Africa. So, by the 60 to 70,000 year mark, you would see that the Homo sapiens are now spreading all across the lands that are being available for them to spread. So, by this time period, by 60 to 70,000 years ago, we start finding evidences near Lijuang in southern China. This one was dated to about 68,000 years ago, which tells you that Homo sapiens are now spreading everywhere. Now, during this time period, they also will come across other subspecies of humans that had migrated during the Homo habilis time period. And there are two particular subspecies that they came across. One was the ones near the Flores in Indonesia, who are known as the Homo florensiensis. This florensiensis is often regarded as the hobbit of the Homo genus family because of its small stature. And then the second one was the Denisovian. And curiously enough, we see that through the Denisovian DNA from a tooth, which was sequenced, it reveals that Denisovians were related to the Neanderthals. Now, it has also been confirmed that the Homo sapiens most likely interbred with them, because evidences show that the only modern humans that have significant amounts of Denisovian DNA are those from the regions of Oceania, which has about 5% of Denisovian DNA, and the descendants of the first settlers of the Philippines, who have around 3% of DNA. Now, this suggests that the Homo sapiens may have interbred with Denisovians somewhere in Southeast Asia and then went on to colonize the Philippines, the New Guinea, and Australia. Now, due to lower sea levels at this time, the New Guinea and Australia were probably connected via land bridge and formed a single landmass known as the Sahul, which was likewise most of the islands of Indonesia were also connected to the rest of Asia and formed a peninsula known as the Sunda. But the Sunda and the Sahul were still separated by open water, which means that the first human settlers of Sahul, at least 40,000 years ago, must have arrived there by boats. Now, at about the same time as the first Homo sapiens were settling in Australia, or perhaps a little later, Homo sapiens also started entering into Europe. For about 10,000 years, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, they shared Europe, and there is also evidence that they interbred with each other like we discussed before. And then suddenly, we reach an inflection point where we see that by about 29,000 years ago, pure Neanderthal remains almost disappear. The cause of this disappearance is still unclear, but look at it this way. See, we know that these Neanderthals, they existed for hundreds of thousands of years, but within 10,000 years of coming and interacting with these Homo sapiens, they are completely wiped out, which obviously points towards a plausible conclusion, being that the Homo sapiens hunted them down, or through warfare completely wiped them out, or it could even be the fact that they just outcompeted them in terms of resources, because we know that the Homo sapiens had a larger brain capacity and they were probably much more efficient in tool usage and tool making. And here at this point, the tools are quite sophisticated. We have hand axes, we have spears, we have proper hunting that happens. So during this time period, during the Ice Age of the scarce resources of the Ice Age Europe, you would probably find that the Homo sapiens just outcompeted them, and this is not something new. We know the story that happened between Paranthropus and Australopithecus, where Australopithecus wiped the Paranthropus out, and similarly Australopithecus themselves got wiped out by the Homo habilis. So at the end of the day, what likely would have happened is a lot of these warfare outcompeting, and then interbreeding must have also happened, because we do find the evidences of Neanderthal DNA outside Africa. So most likely the fate of Neanderthals lies within the combination of all these things that we spoke about. Now, keeping all those fightings and struggles in mind, I want to take your attention towards something even more interesting, which is the ability of Homo sapiens to create artwork, their ability to think abstractly, their ability to imagine things. And this is very, very fascinating, because wherever Homo sapiens went, they created artwork. And one of the earliest examples of artwork that we find in Blombos caves in South Africa is dated to about 100,000 to 80,000 years ago. Whereas by 40,000 years ago mark, which is in the next 40,000 years, wherever these Homo sapiens were going, be it Europe, Asia, Australasia, we find the explosion of their artistic values come about in almost every shape and form. We start seeing pictures of drawings of humans, animal figurines, decorative body ornaments, and cave paintings everywhere. And the coolest part about this is that the early human art which we see is similar in artistic style all across the globe. So, and that too belonging at the same time. So, similar art was being created on other side of the globe, because it wasn't just Homo sapiens. We also had Neanderthals who were creating their own artwork. So, for example, similar hand stencils made by placing the palm of the hand on a cave wall and spray painting around the hand could be found in El Castillo cave in Spain, at Moros cave in Indonesia, and in the Los Manos in Argentina. So again, this is quite fascinating. Also, given the fact that I've now mentioned Argentina, can you think about this particular scenario where we know that Africa, Asia, Europe, these are all connected by land. But what about the Americas, the North and Southern America? Now, the coolest part here is, again, during the Ice Age, when the water levels had gone down, that particular touching point you see of Europe and Alaska, they were actually connected. See, during the last Ice Ages, sea levels were much lower than what it is today, and the Americas were actually connected to Asia via that land bridge known as the Beringia. Using this land bridge, it was literally possible to just walk between Siberia and Alaska. And the evidence of an alleged human worked mammoth bone found in the Bluefish Cave suggests that the first humans may have arrived in Alaska as early as 28,000 years ago. Now, however, during the coldest periods of Ice Age, the route from Alaska to the rest of America was probably blocked by huge glaciers. And this was by 16,000 years ago, when the ice sheets began to shrink as temperatures rose. They must have migrated towards the rest of America. A coastal route and an inland route has already been found. And what is striking about the settlement of Americas is how far humans reached in just a couple of thousand years. Settlements as far as the southern end of Chile are dated to between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago. So all of this, most of the tools and cave paintings in Brazil were dated to about 10,000 years ago. And we find some charcoal inside rock shelters which can be carbon dated to about 40,000 years ago. Now, if these charcoals were created by human-made fires, then it would push the human settlement in America by 30,000 years, which we're still looking into. But the whole idea is that humans kept on migrating. They kept on moving towards different places. They kept on intermixing, interbreeding, as well as outcompeting the other human species. And that is the reason why by the time we start looking at agriculture and modernizing, somehow Homo sapiens were the only species that was left alive of all the Homo genus. And to this point, it is still sort of a mystery that there was a time period where about 7 to 8 species of Homo coexisted together. And yet, this is where we are. Now, This podcast, we have covered the human evolution in almost from 7 million years ago to about 30,000 to 20,000 years ago. Now, in conversation, we have spoken about how this development happened physiologically. But in the coming podcast, as we start looking towards the development of agriculture, towards the development of food, tools, we will now break down it towards more towards history and anthropology, where we'll start seeing the development of fire, maybe the development of language and tools, as well as clothing and other things that came along, which made us modern humans survive during this time period. So yeah, again, that wraps up our conversation about the human evolution. Now, if you have any doubts, obviously you can mail me. The mail address is given. I will again be listing all the sources of this podcast that I've mentioned. And again, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey that we take almost every week, where we discuss history in so much detail. And you, who's listening to me right now, thank you for staying so far, staying with me for till the end. And you have a nice day. And I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.